Hello students, today we will go through source-based skills on inference. Now, you have been exposed to inference when you did your source booklet because based on the evidence, you can infer where the items came from, or you can infer certain information from the designs and from the written sources, right? So we will revise inference during this lesson. So there are 5 source-based skills that historians need to know. This year we will focus on inference and also on comparisons. So let's start off with the first skill, which is inference. So inference is using the evidence and coming up with assumptions or conclusions that you can make. Let's look at this example. Okay, this car belongs to Mr. Lim, and I'm showing this to you. So based on the car, which is the evidence, what can we infer about Mr. Lim? Right, so I'm going to explain. It's a red sports car. It is a Ferrari, which is a very expensive sports car. So now we know that it is a Ferrari. It is a very expensive car. We know that it's a sports car, right? And we know that it is red. So think and suggest some answers of what you can infer from the evidence of Mr. Lim's red sports car, which is a expensive Ferrari. Let's think for 10 seconds. So let's look at some of the answers. The first one is it's expensive because it's a Ferrari. So Mr. Lim is poor, or is Mr. Lim rich? So I think that could be one of the answers. Sports car. Sports cars are meant for racing. So sports car means the car can go very fast, right? And it's red. Maybe red is Mr. Lim's favorite color? Well, all 3 answers are correct. It says that Mr. Lim is rich. That's your first inference, because he drives an expensive Ferrari. That he loves the color red. And he loves speed because he bought a red sports car. So well done, student. Most of you would have got any one of these answers correct. So let's go on to our lesson itself. The first thing that we need to look at inference and inference questions is the type of questions that you will be asked or given. The first type is, what does the source tell you? So the answer would be, the source tells me certain things. The second type of questions asked is, what does the source show? So your answer would be, the source shows me or shows that. And the last type of question would be, what can you infer? So how would you answer? I can infer. So these are the three types of questions or question frames or question types that you will be asked. And you must answer accordingly to what the way in which the question is phrased. What are the steps to inference? Let's look at the steps. Inference will always consist of two paragraphs, and the two paragraphs basically mean that you have one different point for each paragraph. So let's look at the first paragraph. First, you need to state a point. You need to provide the evidence of the point from the source or from the artifact which is given. Third, you need to explain, right, and link the evidence to the point. So the first one is, you look at the main point of the source, then you look at the source itself and provide, where is this evidence found in the source? Once you have identified the evidence, you need to provide an explanation, which is very important. The second paragraph will consist of another point, and it would be the second point that you will make, just like Mr. Lim is rich. The evidence is that he owns a Ferrari, and the explanation is that a Ferrari costs more than $500,000, and the link is, therefore I know Mr. Lim is rich because he owns a Ferrari. The second point, Mr. Lim loves speed. That's the second point. And what's the evidence? Mr. Lim loves speed because he owns a sports car. That's the evidence. And the explanation is, sports cars can race very fast and they can go very fast, and therefore by owning a sports car, Mr. Lim loves speed, or Mr. Lim loves to go very fast. Therefore, Mr. Lim loves speed. So students, this is just an example. We will go into an example from a source, a real source related to Singapore. So let's turn to page 27, source 4. Right? So the source tells you, we look at the question frame or the type of questions. The source says, study source A. What does source A tell you about Singapore in 1819? What does source A tell you about Singapore in 1819? That's the first part. And the second part, which is important, is explain your answer. Explain your answer. Now, remember the answer pattern that we need to do? Every inference must have 2 points. So let's look at the basic paragraph in detail. So I will follow the question pattern or type. The source asks me, what does source A tell you about Singapore in 1819? So I will start off by answering the question type. So I shall say, source A tells me that in 1819, Singapore was something. And that something is my inference or the main point in the source, the written source. Right? I will look at the written source and I will copy and paste the information relevant to the inference or the point. I will explain what I had copied from the source. I will provide an explanation, and finally I will provide a link to go back and tell me or tell the marker that source A tells me this about Singapore in 1819, right? So let's look at the question or answer type first before we go to the actual source. Okay, let's practice. This is a source. So I look at the source. The P word, remember, provenance, right? So source A is an eyewitness account about Singapore in 1819 when Raffles first came to the island. So it is an eyewitness, a person who was there when Raffles came to Singapore in the year 1819. Okay. Let's read the source. At the time when Sir Stamford Raffles came, there were less than 100 small houses and huts at the mouth of the river. But the Temangong's house was the only large one. About 30 families of Orang Laut also lived in boats a little way up the river. There were few Malays who lived near their huts facing the sea. So it is the mouth of the Singapore River, and what are the two main points I can gather? Okay, let's pause and try to think. When he came, there were less than 100 small houses and huts at the mouth of the river. Small houses, only so few people. And there were 30 families of Orang Laut who lived in boats away up the river. So the first thing I can gather is that there were about 30 families of Orang Laut, and there were only about 100 small houses and huts. So this suggests, and I can infer, that there was very few people living in Singapore. Yeah, so I think that is my first inference. I also can see that people lived at the mouth of the river, right? The Singapore River. And there were people whose huts faced the sea. And I also know that people live near rivers and seas because the sea can actually provide food, and basically they caught fish in order to sustain themselves. So to me, the first inference would be that there was very few people living in Singapore. That's my first inference. My second inference was that people were fishermen because they lived along the river and their huts faced the sea. So that it's easy for them to go fish and come back. Right, so I need to do the following in order to have a complete answer. Right, so my first inference is mm, the number of people or the population was small. And how do I prove it? Through the evidence. My point is the number of people was small. The evidence was that less than 100 small houses. Yes, I can write that. But more importantly, I can say that there were about 30 families of Orang Laut and few Malays. 30 families of Orang Laut and a few Malays. So my point will be population is very small. And the evidence I copy and paste is they lived in boats and few Malays is from the text. Right? But I need to explain how do I explain this tells me that Singapore had a tiny or small population because there were only 30 families of Orang Laut, which I should include here, and Malays, which show that not many people stayed in Singapore. Hence, which is the link, source A tells me that Singapore had a small population or a tiny population when Raffles arrived in 1819. Okay, so this is one inference. The second inference would be about fishermen and how what's the main occupation, right? Or Singapore was a fishing village. Let's look at this. For the first one, Singapore had the point, small population. Or you can write it that they had few people, right? You don't have to have similar answers. You can write your own answer so long as your guess, your inference is correct. You can also say few inhabitants, right? Then you provide the evidence. You must quote only the evidence in full. Then you explain what you just wrote, you explain clearly, and you provide the link that says that it had a small population. Remember, I start, source A tells me that Singapore had a small population. My link also tells me that Singapore had a small population, right? So this is my first answer. So my second answer is source A tells me that Singapore was a fishing village, or many people who fished for a living. How do I know the evidence? Less than 100 small houses and huts at the mouth of the river. So I'm guessing, I'm making an inference. They lived near the river because they fish for living, and therefore it was a fishing village. Right? Why, I must explain. They stayed at the mouth of the river, so it's convenient to catch fish. And my second inference is, hence source A tells me that Singapore was a fishing village when Raffles arrived in 1819. Right? Okay, so we have two examples. And now, this would be a graded assignment. Something simple, you have seen it before. It's the description by Wong Da-yuan, who sailed into Singapore. We've done something like this already, right? And we will send it to Google Classroom or SLS, and you can actually follow the instructions there. So students, we have covered inference. Take your time to read and go through these PowerPoint slides so that you have clear guidance on what is expected to do. Do not give up so easily. Always provide two inferences. So the first paragraph is point, evidence, explanation, and link. The second paragraph is point, evidence, explanation, and link. Do it once, do it properly, and you will be able to score full marks. Thank you. and have a nice day.